This is the new Cherry Audio Hex Phaser for Voltage Modular. Though it may look familiar, Hex Phaser takes standard phaser effects and adds a ton of new features that take it way beyond the typical stomp box phaser effect. When we were researching vintage phasers, we realized that the reason different classic phaser designs sound different is that a lot of internal circuit variations affect their overall character. This includes the number of stages, the feedback path configuration, and the bandwidth setting for the all-pass filters. What makes Hex Phaser unique is that we took all these parameters and we put them on the front panel so you could mess with them and get a ton of different sounds. I'm not going to go over every single feature of Hex Phaser because that would make for a super long video, but I'm going to hit some of the highlights just to give you an idea of what it can do. So for the demo patch, I've just got a polyoctave oscillator, and this is going to a 1x8 switch so I can bypass the Hex Phaser just so you can hear what it sounds like without it. So let's hit that, and now we're bypassing the Hex Phaser. You can hear it's pretty boring single sawtooth wave. And if I switch to the Hex Phaser, much prettier. You can probably also hear that we're in stereo right now, so I'm going to take the stereo offset knob and I'm going to put it on 0 degrees, and that makes the signal mono. The first thing I want to talk about is the stages and feedback path section over here. This is probably the most important section in Hex Phaser. As a quick background, phasers do their magic by sweeping the center frequency of what's called an all-pass filter. On its own, a single all-pass filter doesn't sound like too much. So to make things sound a little more emphasized and phasey, the classic phasers typically use 4 to 6 stages, and some newer ones use even more than that. In the Hex Phaser, we have 6 stages, hence the name. And what's unique about Hex Phaser is you can turn these stages on and off in any combination you like. So if I have them all turned off, nothing happens. So I can turn one on, 2, and you can hear with each one I'm turning on, the phasing gets a little deeper. On up to 6. Another thing to know about these all-pass stages is that each one has a Q setting or bandwidth, just like a parametric EQ if you've ever messed with one of those. And that is set right here with the Q width. This sets the width of all of them simultaneously. So we're pretty wide right now. And as I adjust it, you can hear the tone gets different. It's not as noticeable when you have all the stages active, but when you start bypassing the stages, you can really hear its effect more. You'll also hear the effects of Q width a lot more when you start increasing the feedback. So let's talk about the feedback path. Now in a typical hardware phaser, the point where the feedback gets reinserted into the phase network is pre-decided, and that's that. In an MXR phaser, for example, it goes in at stage 2. But with Hex Phaser, you can decide where you want it to go back, and this will affect the sound. And there's even more variations when you start turning stages on and off. And even more variations when you start messing with the Q width. I could do this all day, but as you can hear, there are a lot of sounds to be coaxed out of Hex Phaser. Moving on, we've got the standard rate and depth controls, and you've probably seen those on other phasers before. It goes from really, really slow, 0.01 hertz, to about 7.5. And then the depth knob adjusts the depth of the sweep, so you can make really subtle effects, almost more like a vibrato. They're really crazy, especially if you crank the feedback. Now let's move on to the stereo offset control over here. Now, under the hood of Hex Phaser, there are actually 2 completely independent phaser effects, and if you go in and out in stereo, everything is independently processed. If you plug in a mono source like I have here, it actually does split the signal and process it in stereo. But as it stands, everything is exactly the same, so thus it outputs a mono signal. But the stereo offset knob over here takes the two LFOs modulating the two independent phasers and puts them out of phase with each other, ironically enough. So what that means is it's slowly moving those two LFO waveforms apart from each other, and this phase offset is very audible. Instant stereo. We also found that moving the knob in real time, especially at slow rates, had an interesting effect on the sound. So we made this a continuously variable adjustment, and of course, we made it voltage controllable. If you combine that movement with the internal LFOs, you get some really interesting stereo effects. While we're discussing modulation, it should be pretty clear by now that there's plenty of CV control available in Hex Phaser. We can start with the feedback CV up here. This can get kind of interesting with different waveforms. And as you can see, rate, depth, Q, feedback, and stereo offset can all be CV'd. Before I sign off, I want to show this patch which really demonstrates Hex Phaser's mod capabilities. I've got an 8-step sequencer set to 4 steps, which is continuously playing a little 4-step pattern, and that is modulating the Q width, and then I've got the LFOs modulating feedback as well as depth.